then, what is this program? I was struck a few years ago by a bit of research, political historians and economists at the University of Stanford who put up an interesting paper that looked at the relationship between political uncertainty, which they could trace historically, even as far back as the Great Depression and so on, and what political meant over time going forward. Economic for the economic the nation states, what happened in a sense to social services time and enormous an election, a slump in the economy, various threats such as the one that we're experiencing. And it was a fascinating bit of work which made me think a little bit about how uncertainty, or in the broadest sense, and adversity, certainly in the broadest sense, including things like natural disasters, wars, pandemics like COVID and Ebola, and so on, what that actually means for human flourishing, and human flourishing beyond, as it were, the individual and individual traits like character or virtue, but also the collectives who work together to battle against adversity. What pathways are open to collectives and individuals, and indeed whether education is in itself facilitator, whether education in the way in which it is structured, in its content, in the way in which it's provided and accessed, allows us to navigate uncertainty, to navigate adversity. The argument being that it is only by being able to navigate individually or collectively adversity and uncertainties to prepare ourselves for the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns that human flourishing, in my view, is possible. And so that, in a sense, it was that thinking that has driven, as it were, the origins of this particular seminar series. It was 2 years in the making. We spent a bit of time in another program trying to unpack uncertainty, to look at it in all its forms and guises, and argued that big uncertainty, like political uncertainty, also invites other kinds of uncertainties about our moral standing, social uncertainties, individual uncertainties, a sense that we no longer know who our neighbors are, technological uncertainties, in that we are no longer sure how to and under what circumstances we can believe the internet or Twitter accounts and so on. So it took us a couple of years to try and unpick uncertainty, and I'm really pleased that we find ourselves where we do find ourselves now with this program that really looks, that holds uncertainty in all its forms, stable as a broad set of factors in order to examine pathways to human flourishing, both personal and collective. So that I'm fantastically pleased that we managed to put together a seminar series with that looks very, very exciting. We have a range of speakers, and we really look forward to hearing what they have to say, and particularly tonight's presentation, I think, promises an absolutely fascinating way in which to kick off our program. So thank you very much, and I'll pass back to Fiona to introduce our speakers then. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the introduction to the seminar. And now I'm delighted to introduce our inaugural speakers. We have a team of 3 who are working on a project, dialogue between science education and religious education. Professor Hanan Alexander is Professor of Philosophy of Education at the University of Haifa, where he served as Dean of the Faculty of Education, Dean of Students, and other distinguished committees convened by the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. And his research interests include political, moral, spiritual, religious, and Jewish education, and the philosophy of educational research. Professor Tali is the Dean of the Faculty of Education in Science and Technology of the Technion Israel Institute of Technology, where she serves as Professor of Science Education and the immediate past president of NAST, a global organization for improving science education through research. Dr. Rachel Pear, who's our third speaker, is a research fellow at the University of Haifa's Center for Jewish and Democratic Education, where she coordinates research in the Templeton World Charity Foundation funded project Dialogue in Science and Religious Education. So I would now like to hand over to them and look forward to hearing about your.
Professor Hanan, I think you're muted.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. So again, thank you very much for the invitation. We feel honored and privileged to be able to be with you as part of this important and distinguished series. We're going to talk a little bit about our project, Dialogue in Science Education and Religious Education. We'll divide it up into 3 parts, all open to give a little bit of the framework of the project, some of the participants and the problems we're looking to deal with, and a little bit of the philosophical background. I'll turn it over to Rachel to describe the Israeli context and some of the pieces of the project, and Tali will finish up by talking about the state of some of the research, some of the findings that we're beginning to bring in at this particular point. If I could have the next slide, please. So here you see our team. Tali and I are working together, Tali Tal of the Technion and me of the University of Haifa, to direct this project. Rachel Pear coordinates the project. Masha Salshu, Nijma Obutomakadin, and Maria Bergman and Ori Orion, all are serving in various different capacities as research assistants on the project. We have a wonderful international advisory team. I hope they managed to sign on to this seminar. Hanan Alexander from the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, Michael Rees at the Institute of Education at UCL, and Edna Naslan from the University of Vienna. Next slide, please. So the core problem fits very squarely into the way in which David, at the opening of the seminar, described this idea of uncertainty. We live in a time in which democracy, among many other things, is in crisis. When I used to begin talking about the crisis of liberalism, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago, it was very hard to convince people that liberal democracy was in crisis. But after the things that have happened over the last several weeks in the United States, I think that the crisis of democracy really needs no further explanation. And at least one of the sources of the crisis, one of the sources of this particular uncertainty, we think has to do with the inability to dialogue across difference. One of the key areas of dialogue across difference has to do with science. and religion, and the way in which we teach science, and the way in which we teach religion, and how they do or they don't another. Behind some of the very strong political difficulties, just to take the question of whether or not the election in the United States was fraudulent or not, has to do with whether or not you believe data. Whether or not you believe data has to do with that sort of orientation. So we chose to focus on one of the key sensitive issues. For some, it's controversial, but for many, it's sensitive. A term that Michael Rees has developed and convinced us is significant and an appropriate way to describe the topic, which has to do with the teaching of evolution. Just to take one example from our Israeli case, if you can go to the next slide, please. Here's a study that was conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2015, put out in 2016, that gives you a sense of the number of people that believe in aspects of evolution in the Israeli context. Overall Jewish population, 53% say that humans or other living things have evolved over time. I would say only 53%, which means that 43%, according to the study, believe otherwise, which is a very clear split in the population. And if you look down the categories there, the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox population, the vast majority of ultra-Orthodox Jews, which in Israel represents somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 12% of the population, the vast majority of ultra-Orthodox Jews do not believe in that particular scientific finding, which is the basis of biological research. I was privileged to have corona vaccination, and the science that produced the corona vaccination is in part derived from applications of the theory of evolution on a micro scale, maybe not so micro scale. So the Orthodox population, it comes up a little bit. 11% believe, 85% not. As you go to the traditional population, which are mostly Jews who have a Jewish tradition, a religious tradition in their lives, but are not strict in their religious tradition, mostly of North African and Middle Eastern descent. About 50%, maybe a little bit, almost 60%, don't believe in evolution. And only the secular population, which now represents 55 to 60% of the population of Israel, believe in some of the most fundamental aspects of that theory. If you split between the Jewish population and the Arab population, Palestinian citizens of Israel, you see that about 60%, 40% of the Arab population do believe, which means that a significant portion do not. That splits the population down a pretty significant split in the population across what might be more religiously defined beliefs as opposed to more scientifically guided beliefs. And in a time like now, when the corona crisis is upon us, those that are less inclined to follow the science might also lead to the difficulty in overcoming the pandemic as we're facing it today. And we see that in Israel all the time. On the one hand, we're the fastest moving country in vaccinating people. On the other hand, there's still significant populations that are not following the guidelines of masks and social distancing and so on, because they're less inclined to believe the science. And the end result is that it's hard to get on top of the pandemic for everybody. So you can see this is just a sort of one case of the interaction between political uncertainty and this division of how people go about sorting out their beliefs. Next slide, please. So one of the ways in which people have begun to talk about this in the educational community is actually quite interesting. And this concern has actually come from science educators who have begun to think about some of the difficulties of whether or not in teaching science, in particular the theory, that when I say theory of evolution, I don't mean merely theory of evolution. We've talked about this in our research group. I mean theory in the scientific sense. That is to say, that the evidentiary-based scientific doctrines or statements or ideas that believe in various aspects of the theory of evolution. Now, they've expressed a concern that perhaps in trying to teach these ideas to religious people who may have a narrative about the creation of the world that's more closely associated, say, with the book of Genesis, in which God created the world in 6 days, or some other account of creation that might draw on religious tradition rather than scientific evidence, that could be a kind of form of, you might call it reverse indoctrination. Oftentimes, in the literature, we've thought about religious education as a form of indoctrination. I've actually written about that as a problematic idea, but this, where science education would be the example of something that was non-indoctrinary. But this actually asks the question in the reverse. Now, normally when we think about indoctrination, the classical terms in which it's thought about has to do with content, method, and intention. That is to say, teaching things that don't have an evidentiary base, or in teaching them, avoiding the evidence in some way in order to slant the outcomes, or having the intention of trying to reach a particular belief, whether or not the evidence supports it. Altogether, Thomas Green has called that sort of the cultivation of a non-evidentiary style of belief. But the problem here is actually not that. But the problem here, I'm not quite ready for the next slide. The problem here actually is an ethical problem that has to do with undermining the ability of a person to choose what they might believe, trying to get them to believe something that they might otherwise not want to believe, and that involves the undermining of their agency. Here I put down some of the criteria for human agency that Charles Taylor, who's sort of the main philosophical progenitor of this term: self-determination, self-expression, and self-evaluation. I've talked about human agency in very similar terms that are not quite so centered on the self. The idea that an agent has free will, an agent has moral intelligence, the ability to tell the difference between right and wrong according to some theory of right and wrong, and fallibility, that a human agent is capable of making mistakes. But what indoctrination in this sense, when you try and, as it were, force the religious person to accept this scientific evidentiary-based belief, you're undermining what they might otherwise want to believe based on their religious tradition, and that could create a kind of moral conflict. And those are the two problems that our study tries to deal with. Next slide, please. So the first attempt to try and deal with this that we've talked about is in some work by Mike Smith and Harvey Siegel. Mike Smith's a science educator, Harvey Siegel a philosopher of education. And they began by saying, well, maybe in teaching evolution, we should be teaching people perhaps to have knowledge of the theory of evolution, to accept the theory of evolution without asking them to believe it. But a variety of critical literature has raised some questions about whether you can really make this distinction. Normally, knowledge is thought about as a category of belief. Belief is a much wider category that includes various kinds of non-rational beliefs. But knowledge, since the time of Plato, has been thought of as justified true belief. It's a subcategory of belief. So to teach people to know and not believe is a little bit complicated, or perhaps not even possible. Also, acceptance and belief are tied together in one way or another. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later on. So they moved on to thinking about maybe we should be teaching people to understand the theory of evolution without actually requiring acceptance or belief. And that's a very interesting prospect that actually leads us from the first way of talking about it in terms of acceptance or knowledge, which actually follows the first way of thinking about indoctrination, the epistemic way of thinking about indoctrination, to this other way of thinking about indoctrination as challenging or undermining or trying to sidestep a person's agency, a person's will or ability to make a decision. So that leads us to another way of thinking about how we might deal with this issue that draws actually on some of the literature of religious education. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There you go. Very good. Okay. So this alternative draws on some of the work that I've done on the basis of a variety of other people, Dale Noddings, John Hull, and a few others, on the idea of what I call pedagogy of difference. Pedagogy of difference begins with the idea that in a pluralistic society, in a diverse society, we want to initiate people into concepts of the good life that are willing to engage in dialogue with one another. I've called these intelligent spiritualities, following this wonderful little book that you see a picture of here by Nell Noddings, Educating for Intelligent Belief and Unbelief. In that book, she says that intelligent believers and unbelievers have more in common with one another, perhaps, than they have in common with unintelligent believers and unbelievers. And what they have in common is the ability and the willingness to talk with one another. The very dialogical issue that I set out perhaps at the beginning as being sort of the problem of the uncertainty that we're dealing with. To do that, I suggest that perhaps there are two complementary kinds of pedagogy. One I call pedagogy of the sacred, following an idea again by Tom Green. Tom Green says that in a place where nothing is sacred, moral education can gain a foothold. So the question is, how do we initiate somebody into a good life where something is sacred? And we're calling that teaching in or learning to be initiated in a particular way of thinking of the good life. Could be religious, could also be secular. Pedagogy of difference involves the possibility and the importance that's complementary to initiation into a particular vision of the good life, which is basically to be engaged with people who are different than yourself. This follows sort of the basic idea that in order to know myself, I have to engage the other, but in order to engage the other, I have to know myself. These ideas are developed in the two books that I put down. You can see on the screen there, Reclaiming Goodness and Reimagining Liberal Education. The ideas are developed quite a bit further, of course, there. Next screen, there we go. So this leads us to the research questions of this particular study. And this is the study that's been funded by the Temple World Charity Foundation that Tali and I are working on about dialogue between science education and religious education with that wonderful team that I outlined at the start. So here are our questions. What are the similarities and differences between teaching for knowledge, understanding, and acceptance of, as opposed to belief in evolution, as the terms are used in science education, and teaching in, from, and about worldviews, as the terms are used in religious education? Our second question. In what ways have tensions between scientific and religious beliefs about evolution been addressed, if at all, in Israeli educational policy? So our project is squarely situated here in Israel. Rachel will say more about that in a little bit. But Israel creates a very interesting place to conduct this study, not only because of political uncertainty. We're now going on to our fourth election in 2 years, so political uncertainty is something we're quite familiar with, but not only because of the political uncertainty, but because Israel actually is also the home of three great world religions, the great Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So it creates an opportunity for an interreligious study that's really quite interesting. 3, to what extent do Israeli students, teachers, and experts of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian heritage, both secular and religious, accept and understand the scientific theory of evolution? And in what ways, if at all, do they experience confluence or conflict between their scientific and cultural or religious convictions in the study of evolution? Note that many Masorti Jews who might categorize themselves, for example, as secular, nonetheless had some problems with the scientific theory of evolution. And finally, in what ways, if at all, might a dialogue between these domains assist students and teachers in considering how knowledge works in each of these disciplines and how the potential and the potential contribution of each to the human search for meaning, purpose, and truth? Next slide, please. So the project then is moving forward in 4 phases. There are 4 aspects of our research that are some going on parallel. We're going to talk about 3 of them tonight. A philosophical analysis, which is quite well underway. Policy analysis, we're going to report tonight a little bit on views of decision makers about educational policy in Israel. Subject matter analysis, both of science education and of religious education. And finally, pedagogic analysis. We're going to do some interventions and see if they make any difference. That paper at the bottom by David Owens and Rachel Pear and the rest of us is one example, a sort of pilot study that we did as part of this early project. I think David is online, and a shout out to David Owens, because he gave us a tremendous amount of support as we began to work through this project. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to say a little bit about some of the preliminary findings in which we're trying to distinguish again between teaching and learning in as opposed to teaching and learning from and about. So I've got the reference there from Kathy Byrne's book, Religion and Secular Education, where this distinction is quite fully developed if you're interested in following through. But here, the important distinction is one that Martin Buber makes following H.H. Price said, the difference between believing in believing that such and such is the case. And here, the idea that initiation into a way of life, into a vision of the good life, is not only an initiation into a belief, but it's into initiating into a whole form of life, what Wittgenstein would call a whole community of meaning, or a whole collection of family games, as opposed to belief that such and such is the case, which is a much thinner kind of category. Acceptance that such is the case does probably involve a belief. And belief and acceptance that are probably quite intertwined with one another. But understanding may not necessarily entail acceptance or belief. In fact, acceptance and belief might require understanding. Acceptance probably, maybe even belief. But in order to accept something on the basis of evidence, I need, for example, to understand the evidence. But in all of these cases, we're talking about belief in the sense that it is embedded in a whole way of life. In the sense that Ludwig Wittgenstein, in the philosophical investigations, primarily the latter Wittgenstein, talks about the concept of understanding, and we wonder, in fact, whether oftentimes in science education we have thought about initiating youngsters into, actually, you might call it a scientific way of life, to become, as it were, sort of mini experts of science, and whether that might be the most useful or effective way to think about science education, certainly with relation to religious students, but also, in fact, in relation to science students, as I'll mention in the next slide. Next slide, please. So the alternative might be then to think that some students might be initiated into a scientific way of thinking, especially those that were interested in going on and making a scientific career something important to what they plan to do in their lives. But others, we might want to think about the way in which we might teach somebody about another religious tradition or another cultural tradition that is not their own. One might entail, for example, learning from that tradition. There are many things that religiously oriented people can learn from science: honesty, integrity, curiosity, and other things of that kind that are deep and important values. And here we might be thinking about teaching for understanding and learning to understand in a way that perhaps Hans-Georg Gadamer captured in his epic work, Truth and Method, in which he thinks about understanding as a kind of dialogical, a kind of relationship. What's interesting about this example, and here I give credit to my MA student who's an important part of our project, Maria Bergman, who's just submitted a first draft of a wonderful MA thesis working, trying to sort out these ideas. Gadamer thinks about understanding in a dialogical way, but using a text, like a historical text or a literary text, as a model, where essentially the author and the reader meet one another through the text. And the reader then takes away from the reading of the text what the reader chooses to take away from the reading of the text, which may be what the author intended. But there's a meaning taking place here. And what's interesting here is now we're using a hermeneutic philosophy of understanding. Think of than the epistemological approach with which we began in thinking about Smith and Siegel's way of approaching the topic. Another possibility, which is even more intriguing, is to approach science as something that you might learn or we might teach or learn about in a phenomenological sense, sort of like an anthropologist who's going to another culture, trying to understand that culture, not necessarily to accept the culture, not necessarily to believe the beliefs of that culture, but to understand how the culture works on its own. Here I make reference to Jonathan Cabandier, an important both philosopher of knowledge and philosopher of religion, who's developed this notion of appreciative understanding. I have the picture of the book there, The Value of Knowledge and the Pursuit of Understanding. This idea of appreciative understanding, that we're teaching them to appreciate science and to appreciate science, appreciate, for example, the scientific theory of evolution. You have to understand how the scientific theory of evolution works. In the same way, to appreciate the culture of the Faroe of New Guinea, I have to know something about how the culture of the Faroe of New Guinea works. And this idea may overlap with some important work being done by an important researcher in science education, Noah Feinstein, who's talking about scientific literacy in his essay, Salvaging the Idea of Scientific Literacy, in which he suggests that perhaps, at least for significant parts of the population, what we should be doing in science education is to try and develop competent outsiders. A competent outsider of the scientific theory of evolution might well be someone who has an appreciative understanding of the topic. And that might be possible without necessarily creating the kind of theological threats that might be entailed in the more epistemic approach. Next slide, please. Well, so what does all this have to do with human flourishing? And I'll finish with this, and I'll pass on the baton then to Rachel. So, what we want to argue, and I've argued this in a number of different places, drawing primarily on the work of Jonathan Sachs. Those of you in the UK, I'm sure, are familiar with the former chief rabbi who's written a significant number of books, perhaps one of the most important Jewish philosophers of our time. And the idea here is that flourishing, among other things, has to do with the cultivation of that sense of agency that I talked about, the self-determination, the self-expression, the self-evaluation that Charles Taylor talks about, or the freedom, intelligence, and fallibility that I talk about. And education, it seems to us, education in some respects has to do with the cultivation of agency. That is to say, at the end of the day, the cultivation among within the student of that sense that they're the agent of their own actions, that they actually have the capacity to influence, not to control their own destiny. And so they can choose a path and choose to change that path if they choose otherwise. The strengthening of that sense of agency within the student is a key ideal of education. And we want to suggest through this idea of dialogue between a tradition or a way of thinking or a vision of the good life into which I may have been initiated, for example, a religious way of life, an ultra-Orthodox or a modern Orthodox, or even a secular cultural Jewish way of life, or a Muslim or a Christian way of life on the one hand, in dialogue with, say, a scientific point of view that offers, through dialogue, to create some sort of sense of appreciative understanding. So we think that the end of this process really is directly related to creating a sense of human flourishing in response to some of the kinds of uncertainties that David set out for us to begin with. I turn the window over to Rachel.
Thank you, Hanan. So we can move on to the next slide. For me, in terms of my own background, I'm actually the only person here who's not from education originally. Hanan and Tali are both leaders in the field, and I wrote my PhD in an STS department, Science, Technology, and Society, about Jewish responses to Darwin and evolution. And here I am introducing the education system, which I'm sure they could do a much better job than I am, but I'm just going to do it in a very brief way because it's related to the structure of our project. In that, also you could hear from my accent, perhaps, that I moved to Israel from America, where we have a different educational system. But in Israel, they have a choice of state streams, where you can choose based on developing the religious and cultural identity that Hanan was just talking about. So we have the general state schools, which are sometimes referred to as the secular schools. The next stream is the religious state schools. Both of the general state schools is a Hebrew language instruction state school. The second, the religious state school, is also Hebrew language instruction, but with religious instruction integrated into the curriculum as well. And the third stream is an Arabic language, uses Arabic as a language of instruction for the state Arab sector schools, which serves both mostly Muslim and some Christian students. And then the fourth stream is the ultra-Orthodox Haredi independent school system. And just for the introduction of our project, what we're looking at, we are only looking at the first three streams. We could say that there would be very interesting topics perhaps also in the fourth stream, but for a different related project, I was just speaking with an ultra-Orthodox policymaker, and when I brought up evolution, he said, you know, we're talking about math and English, and you're asking about evolution. It's not exactly the issue that's of the primary importance there, and it is of great relevance to the first three streams. So that's part of the reason why we made our choice. We could have the next slide, please. And if that wasn't complicated enough to start learning about the different aspects of the school system, here there's an additional layer to understanding what's going on here. Some of the subjects are in fact divided and have different supervisors based on the stream. So for example, if we're looking at literature, history, Bible, or religious education, Bible and religious education is in fact part of the focus of our study. So then we're going to have a stream for secular Jewish school system, a stream for the religious Jewish school system, a stream that studies Islamic education, and a stream that teaches Christian education. So we're going to have 4 different supervisors, 4 different curriculums, 4 different committees that are dealing with what should be in the curriculum. So it's a very interesting, exciting, and varied landscape. Now, when we're talking about our other focus, our study focuses both on the biology and sciences curriculum, and then comparing it to the religion and the Bible curriculum. So when you're looking at the biology and science curriculum, there we have a unified curriculum. We have all the schools, all the 3 systems that we just talked about on the page before are studying it in Hebrew in certain schools and in Arabic in other schools. But they're studying it with the same structure, with the same supervisor, with the same committee. The committee would be made up of experts from the different streams, but still it is a unified discipline. And actually one thing that we're finding from our informants and our policymakers and experts that we're talking to is this issue of unity of biology, unity of the sciences. Don't let it split. Don't let it go the way of literature, history, or any of these other subjects. Let's see how we can stay united is actually a very, very strong motivation for these people. And that's been a really interesting theme that's already coming up in the interview. So those are our 2 background slides. And now we're going to give you some details on the project. In the next slide, please. So this is the first half of the research design, the very exciting and large research design that Tali and Hanan came up with, and we're all working towards implementing right now. As Hanan was mentioning, we have the policy analysis where we're interviewing these science supervisors. So there we only have one group to look at, and the members of the biology advisory committees. Now you're glad that you know all the background information about the Israeli school system, its streams and its structure of supervisors and committees. So there, that's pretty straightforward. And our colleague Masha, who is an expert in biology education, she is conducting those interviews. She's looking at current and former supervisors, members of the biology committee. And then we have number 3, where we have the supervisors of the Bible in 2 different streams, the secular Bible stream and the religious Bible stream, and then 2 different streams in religious education, the Muslim and Christian educational streams. So I'm actually conducting the interviews in Hebrew with the supervisors of Bible, secular and religious, and our very talented colleague Nijme is conducting the interviews in Arabic with the religious education supervisors in Islam and Christianity. And the same thing with the experts. Masha, again, is conducting the interviews with the biology experts, and we are conducting the interviews with the Bible and religious education experts, and learning a lot in the process. Next slide, please. So we have a protocol that we worked on very hard with our team leaders and our international advisors. One of the exciting things also about the project is it's very much a project in 3 languages. As we mentioned, the interviews are conducted only in Hebrew and in Arabic, but our conversations among the team and certainly with our international advisors and with our funding institution is certainly English. So we've had a lot of interesting conversations, just even in translating many of the questions for the qualitative data collection and also the quantitative data collection. Doing the translation back and forth from the 3 languages has been very instructive and interesting in and of itself. But we have about 18 questions that we've come to for the interview protocols. We originally had separate protocols for different groups, and we've unified them all together so we can try to have them more comparable across biology and Bible and religious education and experts and policymakers, et cetera, et cetera. So we start off with a general question about the interviewee's background, about their view of education, very open-ended, letting them take the conversation, and they've really taken it in very different directions in that regard. And then we ask more specific questions about if these questions of discussing possible relationships between evolution and the stories of creation have come up in these committee discussions. Have they come up either in the biology committee or in the Bible or religious education committee? And across the board, we have not seen those conversations coming up. When we ask the question of why those questions haven't come up, then it goes in very different directions of people saying it hasn't come up because it's going to be handled elsewhere. It hasn't come up. It's not relevant to our subject, or maybe it should come up. And we're mapping out all these very, very various answers. And a lot of times when we say, well, should teachers address it anyway, even if it's not in the curriculum, then we have, of course they will. And they will, because students will ask, or no, kids won't ask at all, or they must do it of their own initiative. So again, we're getting a very, very wide spectrum of answers to all of these various questions. Next slide, please. And the second half of the design of the project has to do with the quantitative data and how we're collecting it. We have drafted, again, a questionnaire, which is composed of the MATE, the measure of the acceptance of the theory of evolution, which is a standard questionnaire that's been used internationally, and we've added to it. You'll see very soon in the coming slides what we've added to that questionnaire, some additional questions regarding the relationship between evolution and religion. And we are distributing that to the 800 students. And again, these students will be spread out across the 3 streams. Also to their teachers. We're having their science, biology teachers, as well as the religious studies teachers answer the same questionnaires as the students. And then also the pre-service teachers in these 2 fields, we are also distributing it there. We have piloted the questionnaires in all the different populations and made changes over the past year plus of the project. And we are now in the school system. This is a very challenging year, and getting the data is taking a little bit longer, but it's certainly coming through in the coming months. And we look forward to reporting back to you on what we're finding, maybe in your next series. In the next slide, please. So this was just describing what we had in the questionnaire here. So we have the MATE. Again, we had the issue also of translation and also cultural adaptation. We have the 7 statements, which you're going to see in a minute, and then another 4 statements, which you'll also see in a minute. I should just add that in addition to the 800 students that we are reaching out to in our project, there have actually been another 800 students who have already answered the MATE through an earlier project that was done by Professor Orit Ben-Tzvi Asraf from the university, Ben Gurion University in the Negev. And she has not, from what we've been in touch, Tali is a colleague of hers, and they have not yet published that data. So they're interested in perhaps merging their data with the data that we are going to collect. which is very interesting in that it'll double the numbers, obviously. But their study was only looking at the first stream, we believe, that we mentioned, the secular general stream, and not at either the religious streams or the Arabic language stream. So let's see. We'll just mention one other thing from that last slide, that there was a very long process of going through approvals, not only from the University Ethics Committee, but also from the Ministry of Education. And even though the survey is completely anonymous, both in terms of the school, in terms of the students, no names, no anything is saved, the religious stream, the second stream we talked about, the religious Jewish stream asked that despite all of the anonymity that is guaranteed, that the parents also be asked for their permission to let their children participate in the study because of it being deemed such a sensitive issue. Okay, now we can move on to the next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all of these 7 statements that we've added. We actually had more that we worked on together as a team, and they left from the various pilots for different reasons. I just thought maybe to talk about the last statement here for 1 minute. In my opinion, that is one change that happened from the pilots. Students, the pre-service teachers, actually, many of them were asking Masha, the colleague who was piloting the questionnaire with them. They said, "How are we supposed to be answering this? According to religion, according to science, it's not clear how we're supposed to answer the questions." And so then the suggestion surfaced in our team that we need to actually add the phrase, "in my opinion," before all of the statements in the questionnaire, also the mate, and also these additional statements. So I thought maybe we could just look at the last one just for 1 moment. In my opinion, the account of creation in the Bible, the Quran, describes the specifics of what actually happened. Now, this was a statement that arose because of interviews that we had with policymakers and experts in the religious Bible stream, where they were saying, of course, everyone knows that these first chapters are not describing what actually happened in creation. Everyone knows this. And then you look at the Pew study that Hanan spoke about at the beginning of his talk. And so does everybody know that? Is it a certain group of elite policymakers that know that, and maybe teachers and students do not share in this sort of taken for granted assumption, and because it's taken for granted and assumed, maybe it's not discussed and conveyed in the classroom. So that was something we really want to look at. We worked, again, very hard on trying to figuring out the language, and we still want to see what the data produces in terms of how the students answer. But again, we were not sure we wanted to use the word literal, because in Jewish tradition, it's not, for thousands of years, it hasn't been understood as a literal reading of the text, for example. There's always layers of interpretation. And yet, on the other hand, it seems that currently there is a gravitation to what might be understood as literal, but maybe a different word should be used, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just some of the backstory of that last statement, just to give you a taste. The next slide, please. These last statements are the 4 that I mentioned were added in the previous administration of the mate in Hebrew by the professor from Ben Gurion, and we felt that they were very helpful, and so we kept them also in our version of the questionnaire. Let's see, do I have another slide, or is it next, Tali? Work to Tali.
Thanks, Rachel. So I have only 2 slides or 3 slides to share about the first insights from our interviews. So as Rachel said, we interviewed biology policymakers at the Ministry of Education, current and former, and biology education experts who serve on the National Advisory Committee for Biology. So overall, we see consensus among biology education experts about the main principle. Teaching should happen in all schools. The differences are mainly about the strategies. So let's look for a minute for two interviews that we had with religious Ministry of Education superintendents in the area of biology. So they are biology experts, biology educators, but they're religious people. So the two of them believe that teaching about evolution is not an issue at all. And they see biological thinking as separated from religious beliefs and practices. So they are very clear about it. And we see no hesitation. Hesitation comes when we discuss how to do it and some aspects of teaching about evolution. So evolution should be taught in all schools, religious and secular, with no difference. The problems they identify are in teaching about origin of humans and about common ancestor. So these are the two, hot issues that when they talk about them, they begin hesitating. So they have different solutions. For example, instead of teaching evolution as a separate elective or mandatory topic, it should be infused in every subject, like in ecology, like when you teach about cell theory. And you might want to avoid teaching evolution as a separate topic, especially in the middle school. They didn't refer to the high school because they all believe that evolution should be taught also separately as a main issue in biology, but in biology major classrooms in the high school. The secular biology education expert was the chair of the biology advisory committee. So he believes that teaching evolution should be mandatory, but he talks a lot about the how and suggested games, suggested quizzes, and all these strategies of how to teach about evolution. Finally, he said that he tends to compromise and says that if something makes hating it, so it won't be taught. So I'm inclined to the middle rather than being an extremist. But I believe that even human evolution should be taught. So we hear few voices. So we have to teach about human evolution. He doesn't want to be an extremist. He tends to the middle. So he tends to compromise. Eventually, it was very hard to crystallize what exactly does he say. So he believes that it ought to be taught, also human evolution, but when it gets to how to do it, this is when he hesitates. Apparently, as Rachel already indicated, we were very surprised to realize that no thorough discussion of the issue of evolution took part within the advisory committee. So somehow this very huge issue in, Jewish, Christian, Muslim traditions is not being discussed at all in the biology advisory committee. Next slide, please. Then we have interviews with the religion education or Bible education officials. Again, we interviewed experts, the current superintendents, former superintendents, and Islam experts and Bible experts. So few themes that appeared in the interviews with Islam experts. So concern about the place of God. So does evolution take God away from us? So this was one concern that two experts actually voiced. And then at the same time, we see that these people do not have, of course, and naturally do not have the appropriate content knowledge to really discuss evolution. but not only the content knowledge about evolution, but also about science in general. So questions like, what is an evidence? It's just a theory. It was never proved. All these indicate that we have an issue with nature of science here. So what is an evidence in science? What is a theory? So all these ideas that we hear in the anti-evolution milieu were actually voiced by these people. But at the same time, they were both indicated that they need to learn more to be able to discuss the issue, and said a few times that they don't know enough to really discuss it. And at the same time, they believe that the issue should be allowed to be discussed in Islam classes. So these people were, so I'm talking now about the people from academia. We don't have enough analysis yet of the policymakers at the Ministry of Education, or we didn't interview teachers yet. But those people do believe that, that the issue should be discussed in Islam classrooms. With the Bible experts, again, we have religious and non-religious streams, as Rachel already indicated. So even for the religious superintendent, it's not an issue in teaching Bible. So evolution is not an issue when teaching the Bible. And she stressed that the focus should be on the idea of the creator and man created in the image of God. So these are the main ideas in Genesis, rather than dealing with the specifics of how species have developed. With the religion superintendent, we were able to identify again, like with the Islamic, the Muslim experts, lack of content knowledge that really penetrated to everything she said. So she was very concerned about social Darwinism, and she actually dichotomized between Darwinism and evolution. So discussing evolution is good, but Darwinism is bad. So it was evident that this person really did not have an adequate content knowledge to be able to discuss evolution and its place in the curriculum. The secular Bible superintendent again said that, well, this was very, very interesting. She said the discourse is no discourse. So very similar to what we heard from the Biology Advisory Committee. So the issue is not discussed at all. And she believes that it is irrelevant to Bible teaching. So this is the separation, the total separation between the scientific thinking and science classrooms and what happens in teaching Bible in Bible classrooms. Next slide, please. So last year, a paper by our colleagues from the Weizmann Institute, Merav Siani and Anat Yarden, tried to analyze opinions of policymakers at the Ministry of Education about evolution, but they focused only on biology education and mainly on the secular stream, but not only on the secular stream. They had also few religious and few Muslim participants. However, in our study, we attempt to add the Bible or religious studies perspective into what Siani and Yarden already published. But also, in addition to their, what I refer to as horizontal analysis of tensions in teaching about evolution, we attempt to describe also profiles of different conceptions, either among the secular or religious, among the Muslim or Jewish, but to be able to identify profiles or patterns that actually represent the complex perception of teaching evolution in Israel. We are in a very initial analysis stage. We have 40 interviews already. We are only beginning to analyze them, but I wanted to share a few insights from this very initial analysis.
So let's move to the final slide, please. Well, there, it talks a little bit about where we are. I think that's what Tali just said. And the final slide is a thank you slide, I think.
Right.
So I just to pull it together. So what you see is that we've moved forward on 3 phases of our research design. We've made some progress on our philosophical analysis. We've collected a lot of data in the qualitative analysis, qualitative interviews of policymakers. We've just now begun to put out the MATE, and there's another survey that we're going to use that we didn't talk about yet because it comes a little bit later in our process. We've begun to put together an intervention. Oriana is working on the intervention, but we haven't yet formalized that. So we're just in the initial stages, but I think you can see sort of how we're trying to grapple with the way in which this particular problem of teaching evolution and studying and learning about evolution in the context of a society where there's a great deal of influence of religious traditions. In our case, Jewish and Muslim are the larger traditions because Christians are a relatively small minority in Israel, and how that relates to the instability that the uncertainty that David talked about at the beginning. We don't yet have answers to the questions, but we've begun to collect some interesting data with an interdisciplinary team about how we might want to do that. So thank you very much for your attention, and I guess we'll pass the baton back to Fiona to lead the discussion.
Thank you very much, Hanan, Tali, and Rachel, for a fascinating seminar. Really enjoyed that. A number of people have asked, already put their hands up. But first of all, I'd like to kind of pass the baton over to my colleague, David, for a few comments before we go to questions. And if you have any questions, you can either put your hand up or type them into the chat. David.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. It's just absolutely fantastic, and I've noted several comments here. But what I'd like to do, perhaps, Fiona, is why don't we invite questions first, just so that people can engage and colleagues can see what people are thinking, and I'll say a few short words right at the very end. I suggest, colleagues, if you do have questions, perhaps we can cluster them in sort of 3s or 4s, 3 or 4 questions, and if the respondents, hopefully you don't each have to respond to the same cluster of questions, keep your reply as possible, just so that there's more questions and it gives you an opportunity to see what the sort of impact and influence of your paper was. So can I ask Luana perhaps to help us to organize, select 3 or 4 questions and then reply. Thanks.
Sure. I see a hand up at the moment, Weem Hamdan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but maybe you can get us started since I don't see any other questions at the moment.
Hi, thank you for this seminar. I'm Weem and I'm from Palestine. So I have a question about how does Israel create students who believe in science when the grassroots for Israel establishment is based on a religious belief from the Torah, and this was asserted even most recently in 2018 when the government announced the law of national state, which indicates that nationality in Israel is based on being from a Jewish background. And also, I'm interested in the power relations between the right-wing policymakers and the secular left wing. I know there's a conflation within the government itself, whether on how the Bible should be taught and how it affects other disciplines like history teaching and science teaching. And also, when you outline the context in Israel, you outline the segregation in the education system, but I believe that major points were missing, in specific the equality gaps that are cited in many research papers, and how although the state is teaching Arab students or those who are from minority communities, they're teaching them in Arabic, but the content of the materials does not is not going in line with their beliefs, maybe their culture, and different papers cited that Arab students spend more time learning about the Torah than they learn about Arab history or their culture. And also, not to mention that academics from minority backgrounds are missing in the scene of academia in the Israeli context. So, yeah, those are the three strands that I would like to comment on.
Hanan, do you want to begin answering?
I'm happy to start off. So, Wiham, is that your name? Did I say it properly?
Yes, it's Wiham.
Wiham. So, thank you for those questions. They're important questions, and these a lot. And it would take a whole seminar to deal with all of these topics, and I don't think we want to veer off from the focus of our seminar to those topics. Although I would be delighted to exchange with you in detail afterwards. But just a short thing about one or two things. The question of the basis, the conceptual basis of the State of Israel is a very complex issue. You cited one claim, a claim that has to do with religion. Tali happens to be a secular person who doesn't adhere to that claim. I happen to be a religious person who also doesn't adhere to that claim. For most of us, the idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is very similar to the idea of every other European state. This is the place in which the Jewish culture was established. I sit here in Haifa, just 20 kilometers from here is the village of Tzipori, where the Mishnah was written in the Hebrew language. The Mishnah is the interpretation of the Bible that forms the basis of Orthodox Jewish tradition for the last 2,000 years. So the cultural foundation of our country is here, much like Shakespeare wrote in Stratford-on-Avon and Goethe wrote in Germany and Jefferson wrote in Virginia. So too, that's at least the cultural foundation of this. And for the vast majority of Israelis, including most religious, not ultra-Orthodox Israelis, but many modern religious Zionists, that's a cultural foundation. I'll just say a word about relations between Arabs and Jews in Israel. As you can see, this is an integrated project. We have colleagues from the Arab community that are participating with us. Like every other society in the world, Israel is not a perfect state, and there are forms of discrimination of various different kinds that we struggle with on a daily basis. I'm sure you'll find that in the Palestinian Authority. I, as you can hear from my accent, was born and raised in California. I cite you chapter and verse of the forms of discrimination there. It's not a form of justification, just a form of sort of contextualizing, putting things in perspective. So broadly speaking, we're dealing with an education system in a national in a nation state that it's struggling to try and figure out how to educate these around these issues. I would say one thing about that very controversial Jewish national law, which doesn't actually define things quietly as you said it. That doesn't mean that I support it, and though Tali and I have never talked about this, I wouldn't be surprised if she would join me in my opposition to that particular law. But there is a majority in Israeli society that thought it was important. We have in our basic law a law determining the basic human rights of citizens of Israel. And because there is a particular relationship between this state and the Jewish heritage, for a variety of historic cultural reasons, having to do with the position of Israel in European society, the position of Jews in European society, the position of Jews in Muslim society across North Africa and the Middle East, in which Jews were not allowed the full political expression of their national and cultural identities, and in which they were a persecuted minority. The idea of creating a state that has a particular Jewish identity was especially important to some people. Some of us think that had negative effects, and it's not a good law for a variety of reasons having to do with the democratic nature of the state. But that's what happens in democratic societies. People disagree. As opposed to the hard right that you mentioned, we can go into a long discourse about the different political parties. I'm not sure that's especially the point that we made here. Israel does currently have a right of center government. Some of us would like to change that. Whether or not we're going to be successful in doing so is going to depend on the majority of citizens to vote in the upcoming election. Tali, would you like to continue?
Yeah, I will add only shortly. So, well, the main influence on Israeli education at the very beginning of the establishment of Jewish homeland in Israel. So the first and main influence was of very secular revolutionists who fled out of Russia after the failure of the 1905 revolution. And then another influence was made by a huge number back then of professors who fled out of Germany right before Nazis or right after the Nazis came to power in Germany. So naturally, these two groups really established at that time very progressive, very secular, and very scholastic education. So these were the main influences on the beginning of education in general, and mainly of biology education, which was one of the main fields of education at that time. They called it, of course, natural history back then, but this is what they taught. With your questions about inequalities, so there are inequalities. Well, socio-demographics data shows that the Arab population is poorer and get less resources. However, as we said, we have only one biology curriculum, only one physics curriculum. I happen to work very closely with the National Superintendent of Environmental Sciences, who happens to be a Muslim Arab. So she holds a very senior position at the Ministry of Education. Every curriculum that I develop has to go through a process of translation, which is language translation and cultural translation, and the Ministry of Education employs a special superintendent who is responsible for this translation. He holds PhD in biology, but he's an Arab superintendent, and he's responsible for approving any curriculum materials in the sciences. So I can talk only about the sciences. This is my field. Before it goes into the Arab-speaking school system. With regard to segregation, so in general, Jews and Arabs lives in Israel in separate towns or villages. However, the city where Hanan and I live in, Haifa, is multicultural, and you see Muslim and Christian students and sometimes Druze students in Hebrew-speaking schools, and all these schools are open to everyone. Of course, by law, we teach in Hebrew in the Hebrew speaking stream and Arabic in the Arabic speaking streams. But I think that this was a decision made by the Arab minority years ago, trying to maintain their, unique culture and language, rather than totally immerse in the Jewish community, and this is totally understandable. So I hope that I answered only few of your many questions, but
I would add one other thing I think that's important, and then maybe we can go on to the next question. You're actually, the one thing that you said about the teaching of Bible in the Arab sector was true for a very long time. It was something that actually I found when I've lived in Israel now for 22 years. When I first got to Israel, that was still the case. That's actually changed now. And actually, in place of what was the Bible curriculum, is an Islamic education curriculum for Islamic students and a Christian education curriculum for Christian students. And the supervisors that we've been interviewing, that Tali reported on, are actually from that Islamic education curriculum. Jewish Bible is no longer taught as a required part of the curriculum in the Arab schools. Though that was once the case, you were correct.
I see another hand up by Cicely Greaves.
Hello, everyone. I'll put on my camera, maybe you can see me. Let's see. Okay. There I am. Hello, everyone. How are you? This was good to hear this. I think it was Professor Hanan. You spoke earlier about how, like, for instance, you use the vaccine as an example in regards to it's important for people to get the vaccine. Otherwise, it's almost like a sort of reset going backwards, I believe is what you said. And so my question to you is, many people have been assaulted by such things, vaccines, etc., to the extreme of even death and being used for samples for the rest of the world. And so how do you move that consciousness away from feeling like this is something that's going to hurt me? I heard recently one of the African countries received a vaccine batch that says it's not to be used in the United Kingdom or the US or whatever. So he says, I will not be using this on my people in this country. So it's like, when you see things like this, how do you get people past that? How do you get humans to flourish if they have been exposed to such things? And then they get suspicious, like, why does this say this? It's like, it needs to be transparent for humans to flourish. As you said, you used the example, so that's why I wanted to use the example. And also for the previous person who spoke about certain cultures. And it's interesting because I've been working, for some reason, I've been working with different cultures, mainly the Muslim community. And I believe that when you meet them where they are, then there's this trust. So they use Allah. So I use Allah if I talk about God, the supreme being, whatever. And then there's this automatic trust. Like, wow, she's using Allah. And you see that shift in energy. Like, wow, she's using that. So I think, but you have to be very strategic in how you use it, not use it in a way that's any disrespectful or any sort of way that's, as I said, disrespectful, or the energy, not feeling the energy like this person's just saying this to get me on their side. It can work. So that's all I specifically wanted to answer the question in regards to that. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful session.
First of all, I love your strategy about using Allah, and I think it relates to that question of one of those Islamic educators that we talked to about the fear of having God taken away from them,
right.
Which I think it was a wonderful comment. We've talked about that in our research team because it helps you to understand from the perspective of a religious person what this might mean. If you have a personal relationship with God, to have some sort of theory imposed upon you that takes that away from you, I don't know. I made it analogous if something, God forbid, would happen to my wife, the thing that is the most beloved to me in my life, and somehow is threatened in some way. And from the perspective of a religious person, a person that has faith and prays five times a day to Allah, so that's something that has to be taken into account. I think Michael Reese's theory, his work in that little in that piece that in the first slide, deals with that notion of thinking about evolution as a sensitive issue. That's part of what makes it sensitive. As far as the ultra-Orthodox community is concerned, what we just described might be of a problem for them. As it happens, I in addition to other things, I actually have rabbinic training, so I can say with some authority that actually a scientifically proven vaccination to prevent or cure a disease has no problem in Jewish law, and this is true across the boards, including, for example, the ultra-Orthodox Rabbi Kanevsky, who's one of the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, has said very clearly to his constituents, you must take the vaccine if offered. So the particular problem that you mentioned in this African country is a legitimate problem. It's not the one we're experiencing here. It's a different problem than the one we're experiencing here. On the other hand, Rabbi Kanevsky is keeping the schools open for the ultra-Orthodox children for a variety of reasons. He's keeping the schools open because they don't permit internet. So the children don't have internet at home, but they can't study home, so that they have to go to school. But when they get to school, they get infected. And when they get infected, then they affect the rest of us. So, but why is it they don't want to have internet? In other words, so this goes back to what David said at the very beginning about these uncertain times, right? This is something that challenges something very basic in their way of life. And the question is, Rabbi Kanevsky, there was enough dialogue created for him to be able to approve the vaccine. And now when asked, I actually saw it on the news just last night, he was asked a whole bunch of cases like this. This woman is afraid. This woman wants to get pregnant and is worried she won't protect her pregnancy. Should they take the vaccine? And they asked him a series of questions, and in answer to each one, he said, yes, you should take the vaccine. Yes, you should take the vaccine, which I can say on authority is the proper halachic, the proper answer from the perspective of Jewish law. The reason, by the way, is because according to Jewish tradition, my body does not belong to me. My body belongs to God. It's unknown to me. And I have a religious obligation to return it to God in the perfect shape in which it was delivered to me to the best of my ability. So this Maimonides, the famous doctor, medieval scholar, said, if the doctor says drink pig's blood, which, as you know, is forbidden for a Jew, both because it's from a pig and because you don't drink blood. If the doctor says in order to heal you drink pig's blood, you must drink pig's blood. So having a vaccine is not as aversive as that. But in order to remove the resistance, there's a dialogue that needs to take place, and that's sort of what we're trying to deal with.
Beautiful. Thank you. You just really gave me an insight into Judaism and why they want to keep the schools open. I did not know that. And so that piece of information is very important in understanding each one's culture, religion, spirituality, whatever. So thank you. That's really sort of opened my eyes up to something different. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we should begin to draw at least the formal part of the session to a close. And I mean, if a few people want to stay on for a sort of virtual drink and a chat, then I'm sure we can eke out another 5 or 10 minutes. Excuse me. From where I mean, this has been absolutely fascinating. This has been fascinating for me, really, just in terms of some of the big questions that we want to ask through this program, and certainly from where you started, I think the philosophical premise, your own thinking about pedagogy, about science, where we ended, where it's kind of quite clear that there is a sort of contestation around scientific knowledge, and I think I like the approach that you're taking, is whether we can in fact build bridges through scientific endeavor, and they're just kind of three historical areas. I like the focus on worldview, for example, and the sort of Cold War was a very interesting historical period where the Russians sent Sputnik up into space and the Americans the Apollo spacecraft. So while there was a clear and unquestionable distinction between worldviews, how they believed in what the philosophical basis of humanity. They both believed in the scientific endeavor, and there was clearly no question around, if you like, hard science, the things that make space rockets work and how you send them up to the moon. And if one looks more recently at history as a country, I worked in, particularly on, I'm not a scientist, but on scientific knowledge and the pedagogy, is Bhutan. And here one can see internally in the country huge contestation over science and scientific knowledge, with on the one side the modernizers and on the other side the culturalists. And clearly there's a fundamental understanding on both sides about what science is, about what beliefs are. And I think this comes close to your evolution question, but what makes thunder clap and what accounts for floods or waterfalls. And I think the sort of culturalists have what they would claim to be a legitimate scientific knowledge and view of this, and the modernizers feel that ought to be changed for something else. To perhaps the third example, where there is a real struggle to try and bring together, say, indigenous knowledge on, for example, in South Africa, how does one bring traditional healers, people with an understanding of the science of the body or the science of plants, in discussion with more modern scientific knowledge. So it seems to me that in all of this, the huge questions around contestation of knowledge, and the question that I would sort of end with, and hopefully we can invite you to discuss this in more length with us, is whether, in fact, through education, through scientific endeavor, we can try and build these bridges between worldview, between cultural questions, and certainly questions of national identity and culture. And I'll end there, but thank you all for what I think is just a fascinating opener to this, and the huge number of philosophical and other questions that I think it's opened up for us. Thank you.
So thank you, David, and thank you to all our guests who've kindly joined our inaugural seminar today. We're going to close the formal session of the seminar now, and if you'd just like to stay on and chat, you're most welcome to do so. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful to be with you.